community, so they can't really fully understand their place in the world. And while reintegration can be in many forms, so economic, political, social, I'm specifically talking about cultural identity for a reason that I'll go into in a second. And so I just want to tell a quick story. While it doesn't have to do with trauma, it kind of shows the importance of cultural integration. So as I'm sure you all know of Miroslav Klose, the very famous German football star. And so when he was first in Germany as a kid, he was at the supermarket and he couldn't figure out how to get the cart. He didn't realize you had to put a coin into it. And so he kind of just stood there for a really long time and just watched everyone else do it, watched them go out, put the coin and get the cart. And so while other forms of integration can be very helpful, especially when it comes to like economic and jobs, in order to be sustainable and in order to feel the sense of belonging, there has to be this cultural reintegration. So now, what is cultural integration? So when discussing this, I'm talking about the first time introduction into an unknown society or culture. So for example, especially with trauma, we're talking about refugees or displaced persons. And this is important that assimilation isn't the intended result, because this means that they're going to lose their own culture and a big part of their identity. And while with integration, it's understood that they're going to retain the practices and the beliefs of their birth, while also learning and taking on these new values and practices. And so there's this relationship between the old and the new. And even though they're being introduced into the new culture, they're still retaining and maintaining their mother language, their cultures, which helps their identity. And so on the other hand, what is cultural reintegration? So this is used to separate the first time integration into a foreign environment to the reintegration and the return to the familiar. So for example, we might be talking about ex-child soldiers or victims of sex trafficking, recently released juvenile offenders. And in terms of this presentation, it can even be used to talk about refugees who are now returning back to the place that they were displaced from. And so the UNHCR defines reintegration as a process that should result in the disappearance of differences in rights and duties between returnees and their compatriots. And it's important that it focuses on the equal access of returnees to services and opportunity. So while cultural reintegration, I think it can be just as, if not more important than first-time integration. So for example, if you consider a young refugee who was displaced from their home when they were 3 or 4, when they return, if they return, people might be like, you don't need to be reintegrated. You were born here, so you must fit in. But if you think about it, if they weren't with their family, if they weren't with other adults, they weren't really learning the traditions of the society that they were born into. So people might not think that they need to be reintegrated. So if you're this youth, you might not feel like you belong anywhere because you're no longer in the country that you were integrated into, and once you go back home, you also don't feel like you belong. So why did I focus on youth? So while cultural reintegration is important for all generations, here I decided to particularly focus on youth because they are typically the most vulnerable to exclusion and also to trauma. So while children tend to be more resilient than adults, they also have not yet reached maturity and full adulthood into the community, so they haven't learned the identity and belonging. They're more susceptible to losing this. And when youth are removed or separated from their parents, this stifles this intergenerational transmission of the culture. So they have no way to learn about their traditions, and they can't identify with their past, so their growth and development for the future is also stunted. Additionally, there are also a lot of programs that currently focus on adults. They're predominantly geared towards economic integration and trying to get them back into a job market. So the youth and the children tend to fall through the cracks. It's assumed that they'll learn what they need to in school, or that they're just too young, so it doesn't even matter. However, this couldn't be farther from the truth. So the relationship between youth and trauma, we have individual versus collective trauma. So for this presentation, I'll focus on mostly individual, which Erickson defines as a blow to the psyche that breaks through one's defenses so suddenly and with such brutal force that one cannot react to it effectively. And there's also single event versus repeated. So a single event would be a mass catastrophe or kind of an accident, and a repeated would be if the youth was living in a war zone or was subject to prolonged sexual or physical abuse. And so typically those in need of cultural reintegration will have suffered from repeated, so an event that has actually caused them to be removed from their native culture for an extended period of time. And children who are affected by trauma, it often causes them to be unable to regulate their emotions properly. So this can cause aggression, impulsivity, self-destruction, and they can often also become hypersensitive or detached from their emotions, so they don't really have any coping skills. They often become numb. And they often also have learning disabilities, so whether it's a difficulty understanding the consequences of their actions, or they also cannot pay attention anymore. And they have this diminished interest in play and learning, which are both things that children need. And I mean, when you're in a war zone or when you're being sexually abused, kind of play and learning, it doesn't matter to you. Survival is the #1 thing. And so trauma, because of this, it interferes with the youth's ability to develop healthy emotional relationships. They're either overly clingy, or sometimes when it comes to trauma, they just completely shut down. They feel no need to build these relationships with people because the chances that they're going to lose this person are very high. There are these overwhelming feelings of avoidance, they can't really relate to others, and there's a breakdown in communication. So this is why cultural reintegration of youth is so important, and programming is necessary that is specifically tailored to youth who are exposed to trauma. However, current approaches are ill-equipped to handle the growing challenges of the 21st century, and as I briefly touched upon earlier, many of the national reintegration and integration strategies are aimed at adults, and they have major gaps when it comes to youth. So furthermore, it seems now more than ever there are more and more youth who are being exposed to trauma, and unfortunately, with the way that things are going in the world today, I only see this number rising. So therefore, the current methods must be reevaluated, and new interdisciplinary and cross-cultural programming that is socially relevant and active must be implemented. And furthermore, in order to succeed, we need to radically rethink our views of cultural integration and put sport into the mix. So what is the solution? My thought is that sport, and particularly football, is the most powerful tool we have towards tackling global challenges, such as reintegration. It can create responsible citizens who ensure the continuity of a society that appreciates cultural diversity. And as pointed out by Delaney and Madigan, sport is a pervasive social institution, and there is no known culture which is not engaged in some form of sporting activity. So similar to the way that culture links people and creates mutual understanding, sport is also a common identity of humanity that connects communities throughout the world. And sport is this universal language that is immediately recognized, and it not only reflects the cultural values and heritage norms of a given society, but it also acts as a vehicle for their transmission. So sport is the tangible embodiment of intangible values, and the sports are key to understanding the most respected and meaningful values of the groups who are performing them. They're defined by sociocultural rules and norms, but are also socially constructed and interpreted. But why football particularly? So football satisfies our basic human need for belonging. It's a source of both collective and individual identity. And the incorporation of football can lead to higher participation and better long-term results than non-sports programs. Football is inherently social, it encourages teamwork, and when used in cultural reintegration programming, can promote creative thinking. And since there is no known culture that exists of only one person, since culture is a social construct, it only makes sense to use to use a method that allows for social interaction and group activity, such as football. And it's often to say that it's really hard to hate someone if you can play with them, if you can laugh with them, if you can see yourself in them and bridge this gap with similarities that the two of you might have. So play is this behavior that when there's a decrease in the social distance between the people performing it. And football helps in the development of identity, and it also provides an environment where youth in particular can cultivate these important relationships and begin to gain a sense of pride in their team and hopefully their community as a whole. So while football isn't the only means of promoting social inclusion, it's long been seen as a powerful instrument because of its innate ability to transmit social and cultural values and its universal appeal. And furthermore, it's very, compared to other team sports, it's low cost and high impact. So these are chihuahua balls, which is you just pretty much need string, a bag, and paper or something to put in it. And that's pretty much all you need to play football. So how can football be used? First and foremost, youth have to want to be integrated or reintegrated, or else it's not going to succeed. So therefore, the program should be fun, they should be educational, and they should also be able to connect to participants on a personal level. So the program should, above all, be active. George Bernard Shaw wrote, "We don't stop playing because we grow old because we stop playing." And play is an important aspect in human life. It gives us a way to express our emotions, it gives us a release from the stresses of daily lives. And when you're talking about youth who have been exposed to trauma, this is very important. If even for 30 minutes a day they can forget about what's going on in their lives and just play and be kids again, you know, the program is already partially successful. It's also important to use football programming in combination with non-sporting elements, so like artistic elements, so storytelling, music, or dance. So the artistic element allows the youth to focus on their emotions and spiritual connections, which are very important in some cultures, while football builds the collective relationships and includes the play element. So instead of the traditional football development programming, which is aimed at improving athletic ability and playing techniques, cultural reintegration programs should instead use the playfulness of sport as a hook to lure in and retain participants. And when considering football, or when using football, a few things need to be considered. So there should be an emphasis on play and learning, and not competition or winning. Teamwork and group essentials are group dynamics are essential. And so in one scenario, youth should come up with their own rules to how they're playing and not just follow these rules that an adult has made. So they come together with a collective decision, and then they don't feel left out. They're fully involved in this process, and it becomes more important to them. And the program should also not be a traditional top-down style. So they should critically reflect on and be individually tailored to the communities that they're serving. Adapting to these communities also mean any special needs or restrictions of the population involved should be considered, and the program should be altered and modified accordingly. So there must be interpretation, and participants need to feel welcomed and valued. And so when it comes to trauma, you also have to consider what caused the trauma in the first place. So was it conflict? Was it forced migration? Was it a result of their gender or a disability? And so one such example would be female victims of sexual assault. They can often face shame a lot, and these topics aren't really talked about. So programs should provide a safe place for them, and perhaps only have female participants, at least until the point comes that they're more comfortable. And the program should also be holistic, so they should be a total sum of all values, beliefs, and traditions of the community. In such an approach, there's no room for ethnocentrism, and the participants should critically reflect on all the behaviors of the community and their social values. So this helps youth discover who they are, but it also connects them to their peers and instills a sense of community. Furthermore, programs need to be sustainable, so former participants can come back as youth leaders, then maybe they can come back as the adults in charge, and they also need to feel like they're supported. So if you have their parents or other adult members of the community to come in, and they should be involved with some aspect of the programming. So in conclusion, cultural reintegration, it helps youth heal from trauma that otherwise might not be possible without this return to familiarity. However, these programs are not a quick fix, but it's a process. So youth exposed to trauma need to be supported for years, not just the months or the days or months following. Reintegration programs should be a process, and they should develop from the beginning to initial help in ensuring the safety of the participants, and then develop into moving on to reintegration and advocacy, and finally to last phase of youth independence, empowerment, and sustainability. So currently there are some great programs that help youth affected by trauma, as well as integration programs, mostly when it comes to social integration. So there's the Terre des Hommes program in South Sudan, which uses physical activity to help alleviate post-traumatic stress, and it delivers values-based education. But until recently, there have been very few football-based programming that's specifically geared towards cultural reintegration or cultural development. And this could be because many people outside of the sports world don't connect sport and culture. They don't think that there are any similarities. They just kind of see them at two different ends of the spectrum, and mostly consider culture as high culture, so art and music, and they still try and separate the two. But the climate is changing, so I'm rather hopeful, because the way that I see it, when you look at the potential for sports and youth cultural reintegration programming, if we allow ourselves to step outside of the box and go beyond the confines of the current methods, the potential is endless, or endless. Thank you.